Hey, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host Dom, and in today's video, I'm joined by Andrew Mioni. Andrew, how you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Dom. It's really great to be here. It's a little weird being on this side of the camera after following your channel for so long, and now I'm actually in one. So this is new and different, but it's good to be here.
Yeah. No, I'm super happy to have you. Was it 2 months ago that you sent me the draft of the book? Was that 2 months, something like that?
I think it was about 2 months ago. Yeah, I was. I felt very inferior after listening to the stuff that you put out, and I was like, man, I hope this is up to snuff. So
No.
I was hoping to get your your approval on it, but.
So for those who don't know, first of all, let me introduce who Andrew is, and then we'll talk about this book we're speaking of. So first of all, Andrew Mioni has a BA in English Literature from Kansas State University, and he is the author of Altar Against Altar, a new book from En Route's Publishing about the arguments used by independent traditionalists on the justification of their canonically illicit ministry. So that's who Andrew is, and it turns out Andrew and I actually go back. We knew each other when we were teenagers. Um, so the thing is, so you were telling me like, oh, I'm working on this book, and I'm like, good. We need more like, intelligent, commonsensical approaches to this that are in print, not just kind of tweets online,
Yeah.
And you sent me the draft eventually, and I was like, okay, let's read this. I sat down and I read it, and I was like, holy guacamole, this is really good. And so for the moment I finished it, I called you and I was like, yo, this is awesome. You got to promote this. So, do you have the book with you?
I do. Yep. So this is it in print.
Oh,
This is it. I'll bring it in a little bit here so my screen's inverted. Yeah, Altar Against Altar. The subtitle is An Analysis of Catholic Traditionalism. And I'm glad you mentioned the word independent, because I feel like that's something that I should say right off the bat for people, because I know that word gets thrown around a lot these days. There's a lot of
yeah.
I don't want to say misconceptions, but a lot of people understand it differently. And like I said, I'm glad you added that qualifier of independent, because this book is specifically responding to those independent groups, the groups that are, as you said, not canonically licit. So the groups that appeal to things like a state of necessity to justify their ministry, or who don't have delegated jurisdiction for their ministry, so they rely on supplied jurisdiction. That's what I mean in this book when I say traditionalists. So if anyone is out there watching, and if you are an attendee at maybe a Fraternity of St. Peter Chapel, or you go to your local diocesan Latin Mass or something like that, I'll put it right up front. This book is not directed at you. There will be things that I think in some degree maybe are still applicable to other groups, but by and large, this is talking about the traditionalist movement as a whole, as it relates to an independent ministry, a ministry that's not sanctioned by lawful church authority, that kind of thing. So just putting that qualifier right up front.
No, thank you. And wow, yeah, very, very well explained. And I think, you're right. The word traditionalist, I've come to find, has just it causes so much strife. And so, to kind of bypass the whole topic, what I've started to use actually, other than independent traditionalists, because I actually do have some friends who call themselves traditionalists and do accept the council, et cetera, right? And I'm trying to be just more gentle, because I don't know if that's always helpful to I don't know, to kind of cast the large blanket on the whole thing. So anyway, the point being though is I've come up with a term that I find helpful, and people could do what they want, but I've started to call it Lefebvreism, right? Because Lefebvreism can be found in places other than the SSPX, and so it doesn't limit itself to the SSPX. Anyway, that's one way I like to use the term, but again, it's a semantic thing. I like the way you presented it. What I like to tell people is, how about we get on the phone and we talk to each other? And usually that goes so well for me.
Yep.
I don't know. So that's why the video stuff sometimes could be a kind of lost in translation thing.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, that being said, I really want to talk about your book, because I read through it, and you and I have, we've come from similar backgrounds. We went to school together for a while, and so we it's almost like we can read each other's minds, right? So the first thing I want to do is let's open up with the question about the way your book begins. It's not a long book, so I encourage people to go ahead and buy it. Wherever you find yourself in this conversation, it's worth the read, right? And so, where do you begin with the book? What's the main thing that you tackle first?
Mhm. Right. So the first chapter is on the crisis in the church, because that is really what's at the root of this entire movement, right? The reason this movement kind of sprang up, the reason this movement came into existence is to respond to what they perceive to be a crisis in the church. And they said there's
Yeah,
this, massive upheaval, there's this massive crisis in the church, we have to do something about it. And so I said, okay, let's take it back to the very beginning. Let's take it back to what they're actually responding to, because the thought came to me, or as I was trying to research this movement, kind of dissecting it. And I have a chapter, it's actually like one of the last chapters, where I
yeah,
was asking myself, when does the crisis end? And then so that kind of took me back to the beginning of saying, okay, well, if to figure out how it ends, we have to figure out when and how it began, and what was actually at the root of it. And it doesn't and it didn't, to me, when I was researching, make sense to say that this crisis started at Vatican II. I think that just doesn't hold up at all when you look at the historical context, the cultural context, all these things that came before it, and you kind of have this big picture view. And that's kind of the approach that I tried to take with the entire book, is looking at the movement as like a whole, as a, not responding to like little individual objections or talking points that we've all heard a million times. I tried to have a fresh new angle here. And so, yeah, I tried to get to, okay, what's really at the heart of the crisis in the church, say, that everyone's talking about. And there's a really great book by George Weigel. It's called To Sanctify the World, about Vatican II and why it was called. And the whole, I think it's like the first 100 pages or so, is just talking about the historical context of the 19th, 20th century, leading up to the council and leading up to where we find ourselves today, and why it's really massive cultural, societal, all these huge factors that really kind of blend together to form this crisis of faith, this massive lack of faith that we're experiencing in our present day. It's a much bigger picture than what the traditionalists usually like to paint, because there's this
mhm,
kind of I guess misconception that if we just backtrack and we just go back to doing things the way we were doing them before this blow up, then it would be fine. And I was like, well, that kind of misses a lot of really important cultural and historical context.
yeah.
So that's kind of what I try to do first, is start at the beginning there.
I really liked that. And I think what characterizes the book for me is that all of the ad nauseum debated talking points. You know what they are, you know where they are. And what I love about this book is you say, let's put all of that aside,
Yep.
right? And let's say, okay, you say there's a crisis. Well, I think we all agree there's a cultural crisis, there's a ecclesial crisis, there's a lot of crises everywhere. It's actually pretty bad, I think. But that
Mhm.
being said, there's a crisis. When does it end, and how do we tell that it ends, right? And I just love the way you bring these kinds of questions that I think a lot of people never stopped to think about,
Yeah.
right? And so that's what I think is so fresh about this book, and why I think everyone should go get it, because it's very rhetorical, right?
Mhm.
It's very Socratic. It's like all right, let's not even talk about that.
Yeah.
How does it end, and how can you tell? What's the
Right.
mechanism, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but
Yeah.
uh, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. It's let's if you try to research how the traditionalist groups, the various groups, will come up with resolutions, ultimately it becomes a really subjective decision, where you say, okay, when does it end? And then who gets to decide when it's over? How do they decide that? Where do they get the authority to decide that? They have this whole ministry
Mhm.
that they're doing that is contingent on this crisis. In their justification, it only is legitimate because of this crisis.
Mhm.
Well, okay, when is the crisis over then? Because once it's over, you have no justification for a ministry anymore. And I don't think
Yeah.
any of them are just going to voluntarily hand over all of their their progress and their
Yeah.
assets and their chapels that they built and all these kinds of things. There has to be some objective criteria for when this thing is over, and it has to come from a singular source of authority. So yeah, and I'll kind of just go back over what you were saying. Yeah, for those people who maybe have, we've all heard the talking points, we've all heard the same old debates. Everyone gets into the weeds about canon law and whether this canon cancels out that one and whether this one's applicable and the circumstances and all this kind of stuff. This book dispenses with all of that stuff. I think I quote canon law twice, and it's only for like definitions. It's not like on the chapter on supply jurisdiction, I don't quote canon law a single time, because as my back when I was a teenager and I was trying to sort my way through all these things, growing up in the trad bubble and the trad environment, and I was trying to make sense of all these things. I remember asking my dad about some of them, and he had a very simple outlook, and he just said, what, the faithful are not called to be canon lawyers. We're not responsible for figuring out all the little details and little nuances and all these things. That's not our responsibility. So for those people who maybe don't have time or are a little intimidated by all the really complicated canon law stuff, all the really complicated stuff that these groups put out there to justify it, if you want to cut through all of that stuff and get to just really simple questions and just get to just, as you said, rhetorical stuff, examining these issues just logically and just by looking at history and by looking at church traditional precedent, like based on previous councils and that kind of thing. That's what I do here, and that's what I tried to do with this crisis, is look at it from the big picture and not just not get bogged down in the weeds.
No, and what I love about it is that again, if you guys want to know what we're talking about in more detail, get the book, right? But what I love about it is that it's simple but not stupid, right? What I mean by that is that you make it simple, but you don't make it stupid, right? Like you bring about some much simpler questions, and you give an answer that is thoroughly coherent, and in fact, kind of commonsensical, right? and beautifully Catholic, right? This is what I love about it. But one way to put it is that a lot of times people are arguing about the epistemic question of how can you know this or that, but they're arguing about that in the present. You shift things to the future, right? How can we know? And then you shift the question to the future, and that actually epistemically undermines the entire edifice, it seems to me. But okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves. I wanted to bring up so let's see. I'm looking at some of the questions here that I had for you. I want to make sure I ask you the right thing. Let's see. Okay, so I think it was the second chapter, maybe the third. You move on from the crisis, and if you guys want to know more about the crisis, I do a lot of stuff on Vatican II on this channel. We talk about, actually, if you guys want to go ahead and support my friend Jake Fowler, he has a channel called Canon 211. This particular video is behind a paywall, so I recommend you support him. If not, I'll probably talk about it sometime on this channel. But the point, though, is that he interviewed Dr. Tracy Rowland, and sorry, Andrew, this is a quick tangent.
Oh, no, you're fine.
He interviewed her on extrinsicism, right? It's this fancy theological word, and how it leads, how it's directly the kind of preconciliar extrinsicism that is in the Western culture leads to the almost immediate collapse across the board after the council. And what's fascinating is when I was kind of looking into this, I saw the same kind of collapse in Orthodox Jewish communities, right? And in other Protestant communities. And especially in America, there was an association with being Christian and anti-Marxism. And so when the Berlin Wall fell, you see a direct line to a total lack of membership, a shirking of church membership that is directly correlated with the fall of communism, which is another fascinating thing. But these are just like, these are the things that you very, assiduously avoid in the book, right? And so anyway, so that being said, what I wanted to ask you, Andrew, is is basically the next section in your book is about mission, right? And so mission is talked about something that we've talked about more recently. I feel like in those videos I did with John Salsa and Andrew Bartel, I think because I had never heard this before until I talked to those two guys, and then I started reading Francis de Sales and all that kind of stuff. I love this part of your book, but I'm going to be honest with you. My favorite part of the book is the next question I want to ask you about communion,
Okay.
especially because you quote Ratzinger a lot. But
Yes.
let's talk about mission real quick. Let's talk about mission. Tell us more about this chapter on mission.
Let's do it. Yeah, and I have to say, I'll preface this by saying, yeah, your stuff with John and Andrew, it was all really helpful to me because, as you said, this was not something that I'd ever heard of either, and it's such a core element. It's such a foundational element of the church, and I was. As I watched your stuff and as I read Francis de Sales as you recommended to me, and and thank you, by the way, for all the back in the day of all the books and stuff you sent me, all the stuff to get up to speed on this. But it was that was the that idea of mission and how I'd never heard of that, and yet when I read about that and all the pieces clicked into place, I said this all makes absolutely perfect sense. And it's so coherent with the entire tradition of the church. It's thoroughly biblical, like all these things. It's so important. And so I think this is actually my longest chapter because it's so important to really understand what this is and how it relates to the church. So the idea of mission, the idea of going out, right? And this is something that watching your stuff and coming to learn that that's really what the intention of the council was to encourage the faithful to, like, okay, you need to go out into the world. You need to take Christ and the gospel out into the world. You need to be evangelizing. You need to bring it out. And then when you kind of take it back to its inception, it really starts with Christ himself. I mean, he countless times, I think, more than 30 times, just like in the Gospel of John, he said, he references being sent by the Father. I am sent to earth to do the Father's will, right? And then and then passes that mission on to the apostles. The word apostle literally means one who is sent. That's the literal definition of it. And so this whole chain of just the Father sends Christ the Son to earth, to carry out, to share the gospel, to spread the gospel. Christ sends the apostles, the ones who are sent out into the world. He says, go therefore and preach to all nations. The apostles, and their successors, the bishops, they send the priests, they delegate the priests out to, to the various parishes, the various communities and their dioceses. And then the Mass, the word missa literally comes from the word meaning to send. The Latin translation of the old Mass, ite missa est, it more accurately translates to, like, go, you are sent. It doesn't mean go, the Mass is over. It means go out, take what you've received here and go out. And it all just makes perfect sense. And then when you think about, when I was doing the biblical research for this, not only does Christ reference being sent by the Father, he also many occasions reminds his followers, I do nothing on my own authority. I can't do anything on my own authority. I do what I am sent here to do. And in again, the Gospel of John, he said, John 5:30, he says, I can do nothing on my own authority. John 12:49, he says, for I have not spoken on my own authority. There's all these reminders of I can't do anything of my own accord, right? And so applying that to our present situation and to the church, and how the church is necessarily built on this singular authority of God the Father, and then passed down, for someone to not have a mission, to not be sent by the church or not be sent by God, and to kind of intrude themselves into the mission of the church, is a very grievous offense. And and when you see that applied to again, even in the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah, when the Lord multiple times says, for example, Jeremiah 14:14, he says, the prophets are prophesying lies in my name. I did not send them, nor did I command them or speak to them. There are multiple occasions of God himself saying they are not permitted to do that because they have not been legitimately sent. And so when you
Mhm.
apply that to this whole conversation, the traditionalist conversation, and you realize you have these groups and these priests and these individuals who are not sent legitimately by any lawful authority, they are not authorized by the church. They are intruding themselves. They are intruding into the dioceses and the parishes and the sheepfolds of their brother priests and their
Mhm.
brother bishops. That is no small matter, especially
Yeah.
when you compare it to the historical precedent. Again, I mean, the Baltimore Catechism, which is the catechism in traditionalist circles, very explicitly says, this is question 1004 of the Baltimore Catechism. It says, can bishops, priests, and other ministers of the church always exercise the power they have received in holy orders? And the answer is, bishops, priests, and other ministers of the church cannot exercise the power they have received in holy orders unless authorized and sent to do so by their lawful superiors. It makes it very
Mhm.
clear, even in Baltimore Catechism from early 20th century, you have to be authorized by a lawful authority. And if you have these bishops and priests who are not authorized by the church to be carrying out a ministry, they have no lawful authority to send anyone to minister anywhere. And so the whole
Yeah.
thing just kind of falls apart like a deck of cards. If there's no lawful authority, if there's no source of authority that can legitimately send ministers of the church out, then your ministry is illegitimate. And there's really no way around that. And there is ample historical, ecclesiastical, the traditional precedent. Everything is so it's just this absolutely airtight. There's no way around this. There's no way around having a legitimate mission. You have to have that to minister on behalf of the church. Otherwise, you can't do that.
Yeah.
To put
Yeah.
it quite simply. So yeah, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here, but like I said,
No,
this
this
is
is great.
this
Yeah.
is my longest chapter. I think it's like 15 pages or something like that. So there's quite a lot there, but um, yeah, that's kind of the
No.
gist of it.
Yeah, I mean, and we've talked about this before, you and I, and in other videos, right? Which is that mission is a matter of divine law. It's a matter of the constitution of the church itself, right? And so this is not a matter of canonical or ecclesiastical subtleties, right?
Right.
This is, uh, but I guess what I wanted to add, and I think this is a perfect transition, is that the issue here is that mission is not the same thing as the granting of certain privileges, you might say, to certain faculties, right? Faculties and canonical mission are two different things, right? And the reason why that is because communion and mission are absolutely inseparable. And you pointed out that mission is tied to specifically the Eucharist and the Mass, right? And this is what I want to talk about next, because this is the part of your book that I personally love the most, because you're quoting my guy, right? You're quoting Joseph Ratzinger, and and so what I wanted to say is that mission necessitates Eucharistic communion, because the whole point, right, of communion is that in the gathering around the body of Christ, that's where the church is generated, right? And if that's where the church is generated, right, then a cutting off from the body implies a refusal of communion. And so the question is very simple to me. Do the independent traditionalists who have no canonical mission, right? And so this applies to SSPX, SSPV, the offshoots, resistance, sedevacantists, all that stuff, right? Would they receive our Eucharist? The answer is very clearly no, right? And so canonical specificities aside, this is where you bring up the definition of schism, which is refusal of communion. Well, what does that mean? Last thing I'll say, and I promise I'll turn it over to you.
That's
I
okay.
was listening to a video by that Matt Frad was doing on locals with Jacob Imam, and they were talking about this actually. And they asked the question, well, what is a refusal of communion with those subjects to the Roman Pontiff?
Mhm.
And they said a few things I thought were really good, but ultimately the answer is it's the Eucharist,
Mhm.
right? It's, will there be communicatio in sacris, right? And if there is a refusal of communication in holy things, which refers to the sacraments, then that is what schism is.
Yeah.
But I'll turn it over to you. So talk about this idea of communion, of the
Mhm.
Catholicity of the Eucharistic table. Talk about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And like you said, there's a whole slew of Joseph Ratzinger quotes in here because you kind of opened the door to Joseph Ratzinger for me, and I have read a plethora of his work since you told me about him. But
Yes.
yeah, I would really recommend his book Called to Communion for this topic. But yeah, like you said, there's so much discussion on communion in the church. What does it mean to be in communion with the church? And this is again, I think, an example of people getting really lost in the details and kind of missing the bigger picture, because there's all this talk about, you know, full communion, partial communion. People say one doesn't exist. People say, you know, it's all or nothing. And they get into all these really, I think, unnecessarily complicated discussions. And when you kind of draw back and you look at the question simply, it's like, yeah, what's communion? Communion is the Eucharist. That's it. There's no, you don't have to overcomplicate it. And, you know, I mean, communion is the Eucharist or it's nothing. And I think, yeah, reading about, yeah, how the unity of the church is intimately connected to, yeah, the Eucharist and common worship, right? And how, I mean, Joseph Ratzinger says in a very simple, yet I think really profound sentence. He says, "The church is Eucharist." That's it. It's just a 4-word sentence, and it's so. I mean, you could go on about it you could study it for so long.
Yeah.
And he says, let me find the quote that I put in this chapter. This is in chapter 9, where I'm talking about communion and how it relates to the question of schism, because I know that's a hotly debated topic in traditional circles these days. But so this is from Joseph Ratzinger's book, the Call to Communion book. And he says, quote, "The church is communion with the whole body of Christ. Expressed in different terms, in the Eucharist, I can never demand communion with Jesus alone. He has given himself a body. Whoever receives him in communion necessarily communicates with all his brothers and sisters who have become members of the one body." And this is in reference to, 1 Corinthians, right? Where, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. It's common worship. The Eucharist brings us together in the unity of the church, right? So if you are receiving, for lack of a better term, an exclusive Eucharist, if you are setting up your own church separate from the lawful church, if you are setting up, as the title alludes to, one altar against another, if you are setting up a rival altar and you're offering the very sacrament of unity, you're offering the Eucharist in opposition to another Eucharist, you're putting unity against itself. You're contradicting the sacrament, essentially. And it's that's, yeah, I don't know how to.
No,
you're better at this topic than me, but
no. But that quote you read, right? I've what's fascinating is that I found that same, maybe not in the same exact words, but that quote that you just read from Ratzinger, I found, and you I'm sure you have too. I found it throughout all of his. It's everywhere in his writings.
Yeah.
It's a constant refrain, a constant theme. It goes back to his reading of de Lubach's book Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
It shows up in his work on eschatology, which is a rather complex work. But this is actually the way Ratzinger understands the very essence of heaven itself, right? And the very essence of the mission of the church, which is to establish universal communion among all of humanity. I mean, this is like, in a certain sense, it's the leitmotif of the entirety of his theology, right? Which is the theology of the Second Vatican Council. John Paul II said that the hermeneutic of the Second Vatican Council can be summarized in the key word communio, right? And so I wanted to read, if that's okay with you, a quote from your book as well that I really liked.
Yeah.
This is, I don't remember what page it is, but get the book, guys. Okay, so this is, you write, "After sifting through their defenses against schism, one notices a pattern. They almost exclusively respond to the first part of the canonical definition. It is very telling that they rarely, if ever, address the clause about refusal of communion with those subject to the Pope. How would one refuse communion? Or perhaps, to begin more simply, what is communion? This answer should be obvious to us as Catholics. Communion is the Eucharist. But this often gets reduced to a more particular understanding of the word. For example, to receive communion does not simply mean to consume the Eucharistic elements. It means to enter into communion with the mystical body. It means to partake of the body and blood of Christ, which in turn unites us all to our fellow Catholics to bind the unity of the body of Christ together as a living body. Beautifully written, by the way. And
Thank you.
then Paul, you quote Paul here, as St. Paul wrote, because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. I really, that, that part stuck out to me. I remember highlighting it in the PDF you sent me. I was like,
Mhm.
yes. And and last thing I'll say is that St. Thomas himself teaches, right, that the effect of the Eucharist, right, the res tantum of the Eucharist is the unity of the church.
Mhm.
And anyway, so
Yeah,
okay, not to bog us down here, let's continue with this. I wanted to ask you about, well, I have another quote here. Can I read another
yeah.
quote for your
Oh,
book?
for sure. Go
Okay.
for it.
Yeah, this one is okay. You put refusing communion means refusing to worship in common with others and subsequently refusing to act as part of a cohesive whole. We are in communion with each other by being drawn into the body of Christ as a whole, which starts with celebrating the Eucharist together as a whole, not as individuals or as communities set apart from others. So here I would just say, you guys, I'm going to put in the show notes the video I did with Dr. Richard DeClue, who, by the way, wrote the foreword to your book, Andrew.
Mhm.
Um, we talk about Eucharistic ecclesiology, specifically Ratzinger's Eucharistic ecclesiology, but also how he's in conversation with the Eastern Orthodox, specifically John Zizioulas, another Orthodox theologian. I really think, Andrew, that to me, this is the heart of your book because, Ratzinger actually refers to the Eucharist as the heart of the faith
Mhm.
because it's the heart of this entire conversation. And it's one of the most beautiful things of the faith that I can think of,
Mhm.
which is this idea of communion in the Eucharist, in the church, in the body.
Yeah,
And if we get that, if whatever rabbit hole we've gone down, either on the internet or through certain publications, whatever it might be, has led us to think that this is not important, we've taken a wrong step somewhere along the
yeah.
line.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I'll just kind of cap us off at this conversation with yeah. There's there,
Go ahead.
and looking back through, and as you say, this is really at the heart of it. And this was the subject that really, as I did more research and read, the church fathers and um, all the historical sources on this topic, I have to say, this is what got me to change my mind, if you will, on this whole on the broader traditionalism conversation. It wasn't going through all the talking points that we all know. It wasn't through finding some document that like debunks something or something like that. It was through studying the Eucharist and studying how how the unity of the church comes about through the Eucharist, and reading like Saint Ignatius of Antioch, who as early as, I mean, he has his epistles are some of the earliest church documents that we have, and he wrote
Mhm.
to the Philadelphians here. He said, quote, "Take heed then to have but one Eucharist, for there is one flesh of our Lord Jesus Christ, and one cup to show forth the unity of his blood, one altar as there is one bishop." And he also wrote to the Ephesians, quote, "He therefore that does not assemble with the church has even by this manifested his pride and condemned himself." I mean, even in the earliest days of the church, first century, about, he's talking about worshiping together, breaking one and the same bread, having the same Eucharist, worshiping at one altar, being under one bishop. This goes all the way back to the earliest days of the church. It's the constant
Mhm.
teaching of the church, and there's no way around that. And again, as the title alludes to, and as I quote several church fathers who talk about what it means when you set up one altar against another, when Saint Augustine, for example, says, let me find his quote here. In his letters, he says, yeah, quote, "What we dislike in that party is not their bearing with those who are wicked, but their intolerable wickedness in the matter of schism, of raising altar against altar." In another letter, he says, quote, "For some of your predecessors, in whose impious schism you obstinately remain, then set up a bishop against the ordained bishop, and erected an altar against the altar already recognized." So if you're establishing your own place of worship that's not authorized against the lawful altar, if you're offering one Eucharist opposed to another, that tears at the very heart of what that sacrament is. And this is, I'm going to find one more Ratzinger quote. I know I want to keep going about
Do
this
it.
one, but
Do it.
let me find where it is here.
Well, while you're looking for it, I
Yeah.
think I remember. I think it was in Augustine's letter to the Donatists, one of his letters to one of the leaders of the Donatists. He talks about being in communion with vile and sacrilegious men. That being a what needs to happen. Instead of schism, right? He says,
Mhm.
that we ought to, be in communion with these men. What does he mean by that? He doesn't mean necessarily like going to a mass where the Eucharist is a cookie and like there's Mountain Dew instead of wine. No, like don't go to that mass, right? But he means like those are like that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about is like the structure of the church itself, right? The episcopacy. Actually, Ratzinger says, right, a a church that is conceived Eucharistically is a church that is structured episcopally,
Yep.
right? And this is a chief argument against Protestantism and for the monoepiscopacy. But the point ultimately is that, you know, Augustine and the church fathers are very aware of the insanity that is possible within the church. And I think the last thing I'll say, and I'll turn it over to your quote, is that a lot of this, therefore, turns around the disputes over the missals, right?
Yeah.
Over the old missal and the new missal. And I just wanted to tell the audience, if you come to the conference I'm going to in July, I'm going to be giving a talk on Joseph Ratzinger, what he thought about the missal of Pope St. Paul VI. Stay tuned for that. All right, go ahead, take it away, Andrew.
Yeah, and this is I'll preface this by saying this quote is actually one that you sent me, and I said I need to buy this book right away if it has this kind of quote in it. So,
Yeah, yeah.
so this is from Joseph Ratzinger's book called Pilgrim Fellowship of Faith, and he says, "quote Anyone who does not celebrate the Eucharist with everyone is merely creating a caricature of it. The Eucharist is celebrated with the one Christ and thus with the whole Church, or it is not being celebrated at all. Anyone who is only looking for his own group or clique in the Eucharist is, so to say, sitting down with his back to the others and is thus annihilating the Eucharist for himself and spoiling it for the others. He is then just holding his own meal and is despising the churches of God." So he's saying it's incredible. Yeah, he's saying, yeah, the Eucharist, the sacrament of the church, the sacrament par excellence, as John Paul II describes it, has to be celebrated with everyone. You have to be celebrating the Eucharist with everyone. You can't celebrate the sacrament of unity exclusively. It doesn't work. That's not what the Eucharist is. And again, I mean, I'll as you said at the beginning, that's really what's at the heart of it here, and that really is what got me to start seeing things in a different light. And so it's
same with me, man. Yeah. No, and a lot of this, man, I do want to give a shout out. Maybe this is dangerous, Andrew, because I know some people will be listening to this, they're going to freak out. But I want to give a shout out to Cardinal Henri de Lubac because his book Corpus Mysticum and his book Catholicism, right, was just a watershed moment for me. Like this Eucharistic understanding of the Church. And speaking of which, we have Dr. Richard DeClue in the chat saying congrats on a well-written book, Andrew.
Thank you.
A lot of this too was me listening to Dr. DeClue, and I was actually reading his paper on Eucharistic ecclesiology, and I'm thinking, yeah, man, this is just, it's a knockdown argument. Anyway, okay, let's continue. So here, in the book, right, at a certain point, you make the observation that by necessity, what unites these independent traditionalist communities that have no mission or justifiable ministry, right? What unites them as independent ministries is essentially their shared rejection of the larger body, which they see as having problems, right? The larger body of the church. What might be like the implications of what unites them here?
Right, and I think this is a good opportunity to kind of bring in this idea that they're always throwing about uniting the clans, right? So, okay, with that kind of on our mental back burner, let's talk about, as you said, they are not united by any positive link, I guess you could say. So you've got this, it starts with the church, and then one group splits away because of some disagreement or because of some issue that they take. and then a group splits away from them because they have issue with their parent group, and then you get another group that splits away from them, and then you're down to this group of 2 priests and several hundred people in a congregation who think that they are the only real like faithful remnant. And I'm not exaggerating here. This is actually, there are groups like this where it's just a couple of priests and,
Oh, yeah.
and these people all around the world who think that their 3 priests are the only like real faithful priests left. Is because you've broken down in a series of split offs and a series of splinter groups who just break away from some disagreement. They're not being united through agreement. They're not being united through something positive. They all have this kind of negative root. They don't have a specific like objective that they're working toward, if you will. Like you've got your different religious orders, and they've all got their different charisms and their different approaches, but they're united to the church because they're all working toward the same goal of the church. These groups are all opposing the goal of the church, and then necessarily all opposing the goal of each other because they think that they then have compromised or what have you. And I think it really shows the kind of the mess of the whole picture, because as I said, this idea of uniting the clans that you hear in traditionalist circles sometimes, that I don't see as plausible, because you have these groups like, for example, the Recognize and Resist, which is kind of represented by the SSPX, right? So, these groups are all out here saying that, that we have to go back to Latin Mass and we have to go back to the previous forms of the sacraments, all these kinds of things. But then you've got the Recognize and Resist folks who think the Sedevacantists are heretics. And then you've got the Sedevacantists who think the Recognize and Resist are schismatics. And there's all these groups that they don't actually agree on anything substantial. They don't agree on the things that should be uniting them. And so there's no real cohesive unity there. And it again comes from, as we were just talking about, when you don't worship in common with each other, when you don't have communion with each other, when you're not one body, one church, it necessarily just frays and splinters, and you're not, there's not going to be, if you, I mean, again, it's just the most essential element. If you won't worship in union with each other, if you won't have communion, you're not going to reintegrate. You're not going to be working toward the same goal. And so I think, as you said, their common point, or their common denominator, is that they all just agree that the new missile is bad or something, but they don't agree on the positive links, and that's where it all kind of falls apart.
Can I read another quote from the book on this topic? You write here, these independent groups have copious amounts of literature and website pages explaining why the parent organization they broke away from had compromised or was otherwise wrong, and often devote more time and energy expounding on the errors of the Church, Vatican II, and the Novus Ordo Missae, than explaining the joy of the faith and the beauty of Christ's Church. These groups are not united by any bonds of charity, joy, or peace. The only thing uniting them is their mutual disapproval of Vatican II and their agreement that the Novus Ordo Missae must be abrogated, right? And I mean, that's the thing. It's that, oh man, it really, a lot of this has to do with the missile, and I'm just really excited because I'm preparing a whole presentation on this. But I think you're right. You tend to see that this happens actually online, right? Which is that oftentimes what unites people online is, and also in politics, right? Think of the right and the left and the Democrats and the Republicans and stuff like that. Oftentimes in these kinds of adversarial, interactions, what unites people is we're not them, right? We're not that. All that's bad. That's what unites us. It's the rejection of that, right? And there might be some positive things, because at the end of the day, you can't destroy human nature. And when people get together, they have to kind of get along. So they'll probably share some, I don't want to, make it kind of a blank slate. But at the end of the day, here's the thing: is the genesis and the meaning, right, and the purpose of that very community is precisely the shared negative, as you point out in the book, right?
Yeah.
And I think, to me, that's not just sociologically observable, but it's a fact, right? I mean, that's the whole point, right? To get away from the crazies, right? Anyway, okay. Excellent. So,
Yeah.
so this part of the book is what I found to be truly unique. Okay, like this is the stuff that I found to be. I don't think I've ever heard anybody bring it up this way. So I'll read to you my question here on the first part, and then I'll read the one on the second part.
Sure.
So instead of arguing whether the church canonically provides supply jurisdiction to Vegas clergy and or priestly communities, you ask what it would mean if the church did. So I'm going to ask you, what does it mean if the church does provide supply jurisdiction to these groups?
Right. So supply jurisdiction, as I said at the beginning, you don't need to look at a single word of canon law to understand how this doesn't work. I'm going to be very frank about it. Because if supply jurisdiction works in the way that these independent traditionalist groups claim, you would necessarily have to admit one of two equally impossible conclusions. It's kind of a what's that? The rhetorical term, reductio ad absurdum, I think is how it goes. It's
Yes.
just if you take it
Yeah.
to its logical conclusion, it doesn't make any sense. So I think this was just kind of something that I was just musing over for some reason or another, and I just kind of thought to myself, why can't my parish priest invoke supply jurisdiction? And then I said, wait a second, no, actually no, why can't he though? And then it just kind of got me down this rabbit hole of saying, okay, so you've got these independent groups, they operate around the world publicly with no delegated jurisdiction. They claim they have supply jurisdiction. They claim that because there's this crisis, there's this state of necessity, that the church is supplying jurisdiction for them without, even though they don't have delegated jurisdiction. Okay, so let's break it down here. So if we ask the question, why can't any priest invoke supply jurisdiction? If there's this universal crisis, if there's this crisis in the church, people need the sacraments, why can't any priest invoke it? And that's a question I would pose to maybe an independent traditionalist priest is like, okay, why can't my parish priest invoke supply jurisdiction? Because the defenses that they put forward for their supply jurisdiction really do seem to imply that they could. They seem to imply that it's this universal thing. In the very long canonical defense that one of the SSPX priests put out, he essentially claims that if a priest has no jurisdiction, no delegated jurisdiction, but he just puts on a stole and sits in a confessional, indicating publicly that he's ready to hear confessions, he will have supply jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this would imply that any priest in the world can have supply jurisdiction in any circumstance, any time, any place. What that does is it essentially nullifies the authority of the church, the authority of the bishops. It means the bishop means nothing. He's just kind of an administrator for this geographic area called a diocese, which is nothing really. It's just kind of, the priests that are within his territory. But if they would then come back and say, no, diocesan priests can't invoke supply jurisdiction. Okay, so that means only traditionalist priests can invoke supply jurisdiction. And so then you have this kind of absurd conclusion where if only a certain subset of priests can invoke supply jurisdiction, that would mean that jurisdiction is contingent on your personal intention at any given time. Because if you've got only traditionalist priests who can, and this diocesan priest who can't invoke supply jurisdiction, and then one day he up and says, I'm going to actually, I think the SSPX are right. I'm going to go over and join them. And then he's got supply jurisdiction all of a sudden. Because how? Why? Because he changed his mind on something? Because he acknowledged something? Like it's completely contingent on his personal intention. It's completely contingent on his interior understanding of it. And to imply that jurisdiction can just be kind of turned on and off like a light switch based on how you feel about something at any given time, that's completely absurd. I don't think even they would try to defend that. I think if I pose these two conclusions, they would reject this one. I'm fairly certain. So if any priest then can, as I said, then that means no bishop has any real authority. It means the church really has no authority at all. It means that a diocese means nothing. Apostolic authority means nothing. I'm trying to summarize this because this is one of
No,
probably the more complicated
can I
chapters.
interject?
Yeah.
Because you're right. This is the perfect example of a reductio ad absurdum, right? Which is that, like, okay, let's accept your premise. What does that mean? And this is what I love about the book, right? Is you don't actually argue with the premises.
Yeah.
You just say let's continue. Let's
Right.
continue down the line of reasoning. And what you realize is that it completely democratizes the church,
Yeah.
and it makes any lawful authority completely irrelevant in principle. Not just like, so this actually leads us to the idea of necessity.
Mhm.
You say, let's grant it. Okay, we
Right.
are in a state of necessity.
Right.
So let me ask you this, Andrew.
Mhm.
We are in a state of necessity. That
Sure.
that's just the way it is. Okay, what does that mean?
Right.
What do we do
Yeah.
now?
So if the church is in this state of necessity, and again, yeah, we're granting, let's say that it is, and that is a justification for ministry, right? The church is in this state of necessity that allows any priest to operate anywhere, anytime, no restrictions on jurisdiction at all. Which, so really quick, I'm gonna bring it back because to the jurisdiction
Yeah, go
question,
ahead.
because this is connected. Supply jurisdiction, in the way that they understand it, is essentially no form of jurisdiction at all, because really what it does is it equates holy orders with jurisdiction. Because once these priests are ordained, they now have full, universal, unrestricted jurisdiction. Any sacrament, any place, any time, no restrictions. There's no diocese that they can't go to. There's no parish that they can't, or there's no demographic they can't minister to. No restrictions whatsoever. That's not even jurisdiction. That's
Yeah.
that equates holy orders with jurisdiction. And what people have to understand is there's a distinction between the two, where holy orders is kind of the can, if you will, and then jurisdiction is the may. So priests can minister, but they may not until they have jurisdiction, right? But in the case of traditionalist priests, they're ordained, boom, jurisdiction, universal.
Mm-hmm.
That's not how jurisdiction works. That's not
Yeah.
that doesn't make sense. That's just nonsensical. And it's yeah, and it would imply, getting into our, kind of segueing into what we were just talking about, it would
Yeah. The state of
imply
necessity.
that if there's this state of necessity throughout the church where they can do all this kind of stuff, that would necessarily imply a defection of the church. It would imply that Christ's promise that I am with you always is gone, because the church is just chaos. It's a free for all. It's just, we make priests, and if they're available, you find one that's available, and you just kind of go to whoever is willing to provide the sacraments for you. And there's no order, hierarchy, jurisdiction. There's no nothing. It's just an ecclesiastical apocalypse where you just scavenge for sacraments from whoever will provide them. This is not the church. This is not what the church is. This is not what the bride of Christ is, right? And so, yeah, taking it to the state of necessity, and this is one of those things that I learned. You learn this when you're a kid. You memorize the attributes of the church and its indefectibility, and then you just kind of forget about that. I mean, at least I did. I just kind of forgot, like, I memorized that, and then I remember we were having this discussion, a couple of years ago, and you had pointed that out about indefectibility, and everything clicked. I said, yeah, you're absolutely right. We have to talk about indefectibility in this case. And I'd like to lead with a quote that I have here in the book from Reverend John McHale. Yeah, this is from Reverend McHale's book from 1842. Okay, this is way long before any traditionalism, anything like that. So he says, quote, "Those who in every age have obtruded themselves into the sanctuary without any authentic evidence of their delegation," which perfectly applies to who we're talking about here, right? These priests have no authentic delegation, no lawful delegation to minister. So anyway, without any authentic evidence of their delegation, have been treated as usurpers. In vain will such arrogant individuals plead the corruption of the Church of Christ to color with the plea of necessity their own usurpation. If therefore any are deluded by the specious invectives of the sectaries against the corruption of the apostolical ministry, they must be the willing dupes of error, since the divine commission of our Redeemer, which he has never yet recalled, is a standing pledge of its indefectibility. So, yeah, implying that there is a necessity. This again is, I think, a good example of a reductio ad absurdum argument, where the state of necessity, and what they always quote, we're doing it for the salvation of souls. There's a necessity to minister for the salvation of souls. Okay, if this ministry is necessary because the church is not providing for the salvation of souls, then you have to admit the church has defected. And if you don't admit the church has defected, because that's an essential element of the church, if the church has not defected, then you have no support for your ministry. It's kind of, it doesn't work either way you spin it. You're necessarily implying that the church has failed to provide for the salvation of souls. And this is a quote from a former SSPX priest who actually wrote an endorsement for the book. He said in 1999, he was explaining in a letter why he was leaving the SSPX. And he said the following, quote, "Despite our labored attempts to theologically explain things away, we must state that the church has erred. That is, it has failed to lead souls to heaven. Despite our earnest protests to the contrary, we cannot avoid practical heresy in asserting that the church is not indefectible." So, you have this situation where the entire defense for your ministry is based on the necessary conclusion that the church is not doing this, so you have to step in and do it. That has some serious ramifications that you have to address, but to this day, I've not seen them ever substantially address. When you bring this up to them, they kind of just deflect it, and they don't really provide a good answer for, if you say, how has the church not defected? I've never received a good answer for that.
No, I mean, same. And, and here's another thing is, in the book, you also brought up, okay, even putting aside the indefectibility of the church and what that means, how do we get out of this state of necessity? Is that possible?
Right. So, then it becomes this, the kind of all bound up together, the state of necessity, this crisis, this situation. And this is my, I believe, second to last chapter, where I think the chapter is called "When Does the Crisis End?" And as we were discussing at the beginning, okay, when's it over? How do we know when it's over? Who decides when it's over? How did they decide when it's over? And it again, saying, okay, let's admit that there is a crisis, and then let's take it to its conclusion. How do we get out of it? And there's a couple of questions that, again, I was just kind of musing over to myself. And then I said, no, these are actually legitimate questions that have to be asked. Okay, so let's say, when's the crisis over? Let's say, is it over when we return to the old, to the Latin Mass? That doesn't seem to work, because, these groups all discourage or even outright forbid their followers from going to Latin Mass elsewhere, right? Even at the, fraternity,
That's
the
a good
institute.
point.
So the crisis would not be mended if we just went back to Latin Mass, because they still think
it's not just reinstituted.
Right. So, okay, so let's take it deeper then. If it's an issue with the priests and how they accept Vatican II, okay, let's talk about, what if we just redacted Vatican II entirely? Like, assuming that's even possible, which it's not, but what if we could just strike it from the history books and just pretend that it never happened? And this again kind of gets into the larger historical and cultural context of this crisis, where I read a lot of encyclicals in my research for this book. And
I noticed, by the way, in the beginning of the book, I was like, dang, he did his homework. Yeah, go ahead.
There are quite a few cited, and I read a lot. And there's a pattern that I noticed. If you once you read encyclicals from about the early to mid 19th century onward, up through the late 20th century, the popes are all consistently calling out this very dire situation of, the church is in a really bad state. People are not practicing their faith. And 1937, Pope Pius XI, I think I'd have to scan through and find the quote, but in 1937, Pope Pius XI said, "There's too many Catholics today that are just Catholics in name only." And I said, whoa, because I thought that was a today problem. But, 100 years ago,
Yeah.
the Pope is saying so many people today are just, they go through the motions, they go through the externals, they do the necessities, they perform their obligations, but they don't actually live out their faith, from the heart, from the core. And so that kind of, you have to factor that into the discussion about when it ends, because if it ends when we go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add. I want to recommend to the audience. You guys should get. It's not a long book at all. It's very short and It's an awesome book by George Bernanos called "The Diary of a Country Priest." Read that, right? And then there's I think we talked about this at one point. The article by Ratzinger in 19, was it 52?
58,
No,
I think.
58. Yeah, the new pagans in the church,
Yes.
right? And I read, I'm reading like all these other Catholic theologians, and it's like they're all saying the exact same thing,
Mhm.
right? And it's not just in Catholicism. To me, this is a part of it. And it was also among the Jews, it was among the Protestants, it was among all these different cultural backgrounds.
Mhm.
There's a genuine. I mean, this is. I don't know if anybody watching this video has heard of John Vervaeke. He's not a Christian, but he's a philosopher, and he acknowledges we're like in this cultural meaning crisis. And I mean, the whole rise of Jordan Peterson. I mean, the Pope Benedict's entire theology and his complaint is that God has been eclipsed from the Western world, period. Right? I mean, read his Regensburg lecture. This is a seismic thing, right? And you can't blame everything on the council that only the Catholics had. It's like, no, like it's so ahistorical. It mind boggles me. But
Yeah.
I'll be quiet. Go on.
No, that's a perfect addition to the conversation, because as we were saying at the beginning, it's this vast cultural crisis of faith where I like to say it's a crisis of functionality, where and I cite Ratzinger at some point in here where he says I believe it's what he says is the great poverty of our age is that we now only think in terms of function. Everything is,
Yes.
everything has to yield a result. Everything has to be quantifiable. Everything has to be measurable. We have to gain something. And if it can't be quantified or used, if it can't be utilized for our material gain, is worthless.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the mindset of the 20th and especially the 21st century of it has to make money. It has to yield results. It has to build up my wealth. It has to do something for me. And if it doesn't do something for me, then it's worthless. It's useless. We can just get rid of it. And this is something that I just stumbled upon reading. There's a book I quote in here called "The Crisis of Western Education" by Christopher Dawson. And I cite him several times, but yeah, where he talks about even in the 50s, people were saying, yeah, religion is silly, useless. It doesn't pay my bills. It doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't impact my livelihood at all. It just, I believe, as he says, it makes demands on my spare time, and therefore I want nothing to do with it. And that was in the 50s.
Andrew. Yeah.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
have a quote here that you made me think of this quote. It's by David L. Schindler, the senior of the two. And this is a quote from Grace in the Form of Nature and Culture in a theological journal. And he writes, the link between the form of liberalism and the form of the machine is externality of relations. What the language of the machine brings out is the preoccupation with power, understood in terms of physical force or displacement of physical bodies, and technique and control or manipulation, which results from such externally conceived relations. Or again, the language of the machine indicates the materialization of relations in a Cartesian sense of matter. Things and persons are approached as though they had only an outside, as it were. So that's David L. Schindler. It's kind of fancy philosophical language, but his point is really extrinsicism. Everything has become externalized, right? And this is something that seeps through, I think, the entire secular world. That's the whole point, is that faith and reason, because they separated, through Protestant Reformation and then the Enlightenment and all that stuff, right? What's happened is that faith, right, for the modern believer has to be tacked on top of what is nothing else than a lived secularism. We lived we all are infected with this, right?
Yeah.
And the council, you cited George Weigel in his book on To Sanctify the World, right? The council's point was to address this kind of extrinsicism that
Mhm.
all of these theologians were talking about, right? Although in
Yeah.
the early 20th century, it's like, yeah, read a
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
That's what I would tell some friends.
I'll pull up
Yeah.
really quick. Yeah, Pope St. John the 23rd's Apostolic Constitution Humanae Salutis, which was written.
Yeah.
It's for all the people who want an explanation of why the council was called, why we needed the Second Vatican Council. I know that was always a question that was posed growing up of like, what did it even do? Why did we even need it? He pretty clearly explains what the point of the council was and what he intended to do. And I'll read because it's a little bit of a longer quote, but it very
Go ahead.
very
Yeah.
clearly explains it. So he said, quote, "Today the church is witnessing a crisis underway within society." He even acknowledges that it's a crisis already. He says, "While humanity is at the threshold of a new age, immensely serious and broad tasks await the church, as in the most tragic periods of her history. It is a question, in fact, of bringing the perennial life-giving energies of the gospel to the modern world, a world that boasts of its technical and scientific conquests, but also bears the effects of a temporal order that some have wanted to reorganize by excluding God. This is why modern society is characterized by great material progress, but without a corresponding advance in the moral sphere. Thence a weakening in aspirations toward the values of the spirit. Thence the tendency to seek only the earthly pleasures that technological progress brings so easily within the reach of all. Thence also a quite new and disturbing fact, the existence of a militant atheism operating all over the world." End quote. So
Wow.
yeah, the council is being called to address militant atheism, militant secularism. It's a world that is so interconnected and so dominated by this, this secular mindset, this materialistic,
Yeah.
functional mindset that we have no room for
Mhm.
God in it anymore. And that's what the intent of the council was to, kind of rejuvenate the the rejuvenate bringing the gospel out into the world and living according to the gospel.
Yeah.
So I mean that's a bigger conversation, but
No. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. There's so much, man. That we'll have to get together and just sip on some wine, soak some cigars, and talk about this stuff more. But
yeah,
no, there's so much, man. Like to me, it was really like deciding to not take things from the pundits anymore, and to actually sit down and do the hard work and read through things. Uh, just like you did with those encyclicals, just like you did with George Weigel's book and Ratzinger's stuff, and the Survey of Pink Hairs book. And we talked about that a little bit as
yep,
well. If you sit down and you log off the internet, right? And this is what I keep telling people, right? It's not about accumulation of information, but it's about going to some wise thinkers and being informed of the landscape, and what emerges is something much different, is what I've realized. And
yeah,
I know people get people that are more in the independent crowd that we're criticizing get on my back about this, but I'm telling you, when I read Henri de Lubac, it was like the scales falling from my eyes. His criticism of secularism, of extrinsicism. I just finished his book on nature and grace, and I know it's still debated in some areas, but the point though is that you know I don't know. When I read his Corpus Mysticum in Catholicism, it's like it became clear, right? It became clear. And so one thing I want to say, and I know this show isn't about my rants, but
I was
what I wanted to say is that one thing I noticed, guess what? There's a pattern with the complaints, right? So some of the complaints are, of course, there's the complaints about ecumenism, obviously not the abuses, but the what's taught by the council. There's
Mhm.
complaints about collegiality. There's complaints about religious liberty. Those are the three that Lefebvre pointed out, right? And
Mhm.
there's other complaints, such as, for example, the term subsistit in Lumen Gentium about the church,
Sure.
and Dei Verbum seems to be more poetic and a little wishy-washy and not the hard truth, right? What I notice is that there's a thread that ties all of these complaints, all of these themes from the conciliar documents, and the thread is this: it's an application of Trinitarian theology to ecclesiology. It's an application of relationality, of the fact that the truth is a person, right? And that it requires truth and freedom, right? To ecclesiology through the word of God. Dei verbum lumen gentium flow, sacrosanctum concilium starts the liturgy first, right? And I
Yep.
think we need to work on that. And so I'm telling you, the scales started falling from my eyes to seeing all this, right? So I'm sorry for the tangent, but
No, it's
let's see
great.
if I can ask you. Um, oh man, I had some quotes from your book, but let me just read a couple quotes real quick because I really want to get people to buy this book. I really recommend it, guys. I'll put the link in the show notes. You write here, Andrew, how could divine law ever permit two opposing authorities to both be legitimate when their very power comes from the unity and oneness of the Eucharist and is directed toward fostering the unity of the church? This is a contradiction and would imply that the church and therefore the Lord could sanction division or disunity. Right? I love that quote because what do we know from Jesus in John chapter 17? His prayer is for unity, and it's the unity that he has with the Father that he wants us to have. Again, Trinity, ecclesiology. To me, it's like
Yeah.
it's all there. And then the last quote I wanted to read from you is if they remain these independent traditions, right? If they remain at a perpetual theological impasse with their Catholic neighbors, how can they be expected to engage further with those who are not familiar with Christianity at all? They have become too fixated on their own inner life to concern themselves with meaningful outreach. And I'm reading that quote in particular because this is another point that stuck out in your book. Is you use the phrase that you take from Ratzinger of a self-enclosed circle.
Hmm.
Okay, full disclosure, right? Dom here from the Logos Project is radically pro ad orientem. Okay. You don't have to agree with me. That's totally fine. Right. I think that I'll leave it at that. Okay. We can argue about this around some drinks if you want. That being said, I love how you use this idea of the self enclosed circle to talk about the necessary like sociological outcome, right, of these independent groups.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And I would put myself in that same camp with you. My personal opinion is that ad orientem is the way to go. But as I say in the book, it's not my place to dictate which one. I mean, I have no say in this matter. The church has allowed either one, and I say, okay, the church has allowed it, and that it is what it is. And the debate over which one is better, while it's a debate that can be had, I think it offers a really good opportunity for some self-reflection, because you hear that quote from Ratzinger all the time where he describes the versus populum position as a self-enclosed circle. Okay, let's take that and apply it though to this idea of a community or a traditionalist group. How I would pose this question to audience members, maybe who have frequented these groups. How many adult baptisms have you seen? Like, how many adult baptisms have you witnessed? Because I went to, I've been through multiple different groups, independent group being, one of them for a time. I have seen 2 adult baptisms in my entire life.
Yeah.
And lots of infant baptisms, of course, but these groups they all kind of, there are multiple elements that kind of intertwine and bring about this, I don't want to say victim mentality, because it sounds kind of harsh,
Yeah.
but it's this feeling of persecution of like what we have to protect it. We have to kind of protect
Yeah.
it from people who want to take it away from us. And so they retreat and they huddle together, and they kind of, ironically, show why it is that Vatican II needs to be implemented and why its goals were admirable. Because what Vatican II said was go out, and what the independent trads are saying is we're going to shut ourselves in. We're gonna just stay here and wait until the crisis has died down and we have just grown in numbers enough to kind of supplant it, right? Which whole
Yeah.
other conversation. But yeah, and this image of a self-enclosed circle, of this community of, it's this self-enclosed community that does not bring the gospel out into the world. It doesn't, I mean, what's the, I don't know the chapter and verse off the top of my head, but when Christ said we don't hide the light under a bushel basket, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
We don't hide it. We don't keep it for ourselves. We bring it out. And these communities just stay close knit. They stay, tight knit, and they don't bring it out. And I think that is a big problem, because they're missing the whole, they don't evangelize, they don't bring people into the church, they just hold on to and they preserve what they have, and that's not what we're called to do. And I think this term, or this image of a self-enclosed circle, we can apply it to these communities just as well. It's this self-enclosed groups that don't go out.
Yeah. No, I wanted to say, like, I mean, my experience has obviously been exactly the same, right? Now, of course, I really appreciate how, like, you're trying to be careful with your words. People don't realize this is tricky, okay, being online, because this is why I say it's easier to talk one-on-one to people. But yeah, we're talking about independent traditionalist groups who do not have a lawful ministry, and by necessity, you're right, they self-enclose, and their very existence, right, presupposes a survival mission, the holy remnant that is surviving from the apostate church, right? I mean, but here's the thing, dude. Like, we've had at my parish, like, maybe, I don't know. Let's see. We've had, like, every year. So in RCIA, we have like 20 students, adult students in RCIA, right? But we, and some of them are already baptized. So baptism wise, right? Like, we probably get, I don't know, maybe it depends on the year. We've had as little as, I think it was 5 or 6, and as many as like 25, right? But this is like every single year, and that's just baptisms, right? And so and again, it doesn't mean that there's not things that we can learn, right? And
Sure.
I'm actually trying to do that, right? I'm trying to bridge a lot of this stuff because
Yeah.
people are upset about this stuff. I also wanted to point out, clearly I mentioned about facing the people during liturgy of the word. Not only do I agree with that, I think that it doesn't make sense to me to face east during liturgy of the word. I'm against that, to be clear.
And
So yeah,
really
yeah, go
quick
ahead.
also, and I'm sure you know this already, but immediately after his quote about a self-enclosed circle, Ratzinger says exactly the same thing. He says,
Yeah,
a face-to-face exchange during the liturgy of the word makes more sense. And that,
yeah, I'm
maybe the,
completely, yeah.
yeah, yeah, go
Absolutely. I think it makes no sense whatsoever to face east during the liturgy of the word. Now, I mean, okay, I guess I should probably be a little bit more gentle with my language here because the church did do it, right? And so same with, like, facing the people during the canon, the church does it. But also, like, I'm pretty sure it's been inscribed into the rubrics now that the crucifix has to be the liturgical east, even when the priest faces the people during the canon,
ahead.
right? That being said, I think it makes perfect sense that the priest face the people. And this is not just me. I mean, this is for Louis Bouillet, Joseph Ratzinger. I won't bring up some other ones because people freak out. But that being said, okay, let's see. I think I could. Oh yeah, you did talk about. I don't know if we have time for this, Andrew, but you did talk about this kind of functionalization of the church through a misunderstanding of it being an institution.
Yeah,
What do you think? Do you want to talk about that a little
yeah.
bit?
I have time if you do.
Okay, let's do it. Let's do it.
Sure, sure. So this is kind of the more provocative conclusion that I reach in this book is that, as I
Yeah.
was saying earlier, where this idea of functionality that has permeated our culture and that has kind of pushed God out. I I see this in the independent traditionalist community, and this is why I think, to be quite frank, they're just adding fuel to the fire. Because, and I'll explain. It's a little, it might take me a
Yeah.
second here, but I'll explain. So,
Sure.
as we were talking about with the church and the Eucharist, and how there's this, the necessary spiritual reality underlying the whole thing, right? Communion is not just I receive communion at Mass; it's the unity of the church in one body, right?
Mhm.
Episcopal authority is not just something that you can kind of take for yourself. It's not something that you can just, oh, that guy's a bishop and he can give me, he can consecrate me a bishop. So I'll just get it from him. Like, the episcopal authority only makes sense. It's
In the communion of the
necessarily
college. Yeah.
connected in the communion of the College of Bishops. It's a cohesive whole of the
Mhm.
College of Bishops. There's all these spiritual realities underlying the whole thing, and the independent traditionalist ministry rejects all of that for the sake of its function. And I'm going to find the section in the book where I talk about that.
Real
So I
quick, while you're finding that,
Yep.
there's a direct quote in Call to Communion where Ratzinger says that a bishop does not succeed a bishop individually. It's not that each bishop can trace his line back to one of the 12 apostles. Succession applies to the communion of the church, right? What succeeds one thing from another is the communion of the college. And that makes sense. If the church is communion, then the church continues, right? The church continues to exist through history. That's what the word subsists means,
Yeah.
right? But that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, let me let's see. This is page 184 of the book. So I say, consider the following facts. Traditionalists disregard the necessary spiritual realities underlying the sacraments and the authority of the church for the sake of their functionality. As long as they have valid priests, or sorry, excuse me, as long as they have valid bishops who can consecrate valid priests and have valid priests who can administer valid sacraments, it does not matter that they do not operate in communion with the church or with the lawful authorities or even with other traditionalist groups. For them, the Eucharist is no longer the Eucharist of the whole church. It is that of a select few who agree with each other on certain topics. Bishops are no longer truly bishops. They are priest makers, confirmands, church consecrators, nothing more than living tools to ensure an apostolate does not die out. Priests are ordained simply for the sake of providing sacraments in a, quote, time of need, and as substitutes for the lawful pastors of a diocese, no less. Catholic communities are no longer about living and growing in union with other communities. They exist to offer an alternative to the community down the street. All of these things are, as I say, subordinated to the functions of their parts. They're,
That's right. Yeah.
we disregard the communion and the unity of the church as long as we can have a valid Eucharist, as long as we can have a valid Mass. We disregard the unity of the College of Bishops as long as we have a valid bishop who can give us valid priests. And there's just a continuation of, as long as we have the things, the external. You're going to have to fill me in on what you were saying earlier about everything is reduced
About
to
the succession.
right, and how
No, yeah, externality.
the Schindler quote, about externality.
Yeah,
how,
it's like a machine, right? Yeah,
right. It's this kind of ecclesiastical machine. It's just these cogs in the machine that, like, okay, valid bishop, valid priest, valid sacraments. Are we operating in communion with the other Catholic church in town? Are we operating with the other Latin Mass community down the street? Is our bishop in union with other bishops? I mean, the answer to all these questions is no. I mean, these bishops travel around the world carrying out episcopal functions where they are not allowed to do that in the dioceses of their brother bishops. It's just all of these things are reduced to their, as long as it works, as long as it's valid, as long as we have it, and it's disconnected from the unity of the church as a whole. And that, I think, is why ultimately this can't serve as the solution to the crisis in the church, because at its root, it's entrenched in the same problems as the crisis, which is this functionality. As long as it's functional, as long as it works, any spiritual realities that are necessarily tied into it, we can just kind of disregard those because they're inconvenient. And that's why ultimately my conclusion is that this independent traditionalist ministry just perpetuates the crisis. My conclusion is that it just makes it worse.
I totally agree. And can I add that the issue at heart here is communion, right? And it's also acceptance of the council and the missal. It seems to me that the granting of faculties to the Society of St. Pius X, not its offshoots, right, is not an invitation for Catholics to go frequent their chapels. Because when the Pope does this, right, in the letter that he wrote, right, he's doing it for the faithful already frequenting the chapels so that they might come back, right? and so I think there's what's missing here is that what was I going to say? There's something fundamentally problematic when approaching this question in terms of canonical legalities to prove that it's okay to go there.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you read Summorum Pontificum, Pope Benedict says it's not a disciplinary question. It's not a question of canonical specificities. What does he say? It's doctrinal, right? There is no Eucharistic communion and no legitimate ministry, despite the granting of special faculties, because there's no doctrinal acceptance of the authority of an ecumenical council and of a liturgy promulgated by the church.
Yeah,
that's why. So I just, a lot of times, again, this is what I love about the book. Just to plug it in one more time, right? It really does circumvent a lot of this talk and say, let's just use common sense and ask simple questions. But it's simple, but it's not stupid. It actually it's very enlightening. So everybody get the book. We've been going for an hour and 24 minutes, Andrew. Is there anything you really want to hammer home? Because I don't have to go now, but this might be a good place to wrap up. What do you think?
Yeah, let me do a quick scan of this here. Just see. I might just give a
Okay, yeah,
quick
go ahead.
summary of what it's about, and and thank you for reinforcing that. I really do believe that this is something new, something fresh in the traditionalism conversation. And Lord knows this is such a hotly debated topic, and everyone's an expert on this stuff. And
Yeah,
and it's a huge topic, and it's a subject of a lot of controversy. But as a friend said when I announced my that I was going to write this book and how I was going to approach it, she said, "This is great because this isn't the immediate aftermath of this isn't the 90s. This isn't hotel masses and Michael Davies apologetics anymore. This is decades later. They've rehashed kind of everyone, has used the same talking points and the same arguments over and over. The people who are
that's right.
convinced by them are convinced by them, and the people who are not are not. And there's nothing
Stalemate.
new to right. We're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
And
And
I
then you
think
come in with the bulldozer. I love it. Yeah.
well, I try to bring a fresh perspective, a fresh outlook on this stuff. As I said, I don't quote canon law really at all. I don't quote any of the usual talking points. I don't get into the little nitty gritty details about does their mass fulfill the obligation, or were the excommunications valid, or like any of this stuff. That's all. I don't want to say it's irrelevant. It's not that it's irrelevant, but
Right.
For what we're trying to accomplish here, those are not the kind of questions we should be asking. It's like it's like, what's that character from Jurassic Park where he says, they're so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think about if they should. So that's what I feel like is a great summary of the entire traditionalism conversation. Is everyone is
that
so
should be
hyper.
The thumbnail. I'll have a T-Rex on the thumbnail.
Yeah.
Oh,
No, but
man.
it's like everyone is so preoccupied with figuring out whether or not whether or not it's legitimate or valid, or whether their bishop has said it's allowed or whatever, that they don't stop and pull back and look at the picture as a whole and think about should I do this? Is this a good idea?
Right.
In relation to the bigger picture and the church as a whole and the movement as a whole. Your mass may be valid, but there's that question of communion and common worship. There's there's I'm trying to think of something else that might apply here. It's like, your parish might be, full of families and children, which is great. That's awesome. But if you're all staying enclosed in your parish and not bringing the gospel out, you're not bringing the light of Christ out into the world, then that's a problem. And so there are these things that are good, but then in the big picture, there are serious issues that need to be addressed. And that's kind of what I tried to do here, is present something fresh, something new, something to add to the conversation that I don't think a lot of people are talking about. As I said, I cite from, I can't even tell you how many encyclicals. There's a lot of them. I cite from a lot of books and resources from like the 19th century. I mean, very, traditional sources. I think I have, something unique on my hands here, and I think it will be really helpful in the conversation.
I completely agree, and I will put a link to the book down below. Make this man rich; he deserves it. And I wanted to quote the Second Vatican Council in light of what you just said about the, to be authentically Catholic implies this missionary attitude, right? And this is at the heart of the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, whom you quote so much in the book, right? Which is this idea of communion is only possible when you're in a relation to the Catholica, to the Communio, to the Eucharist, to the body of Christ, to your neighbor. You can only have Christ with your brothers and sisters, or you can't have him at all, is what Ratzinger says. The Second Vatican Council says man cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. That's it. That's, to me, the heart of your book, right? It's the heart of the point here. And then, and we're gonna, if you guys have more, well, what about Pope Francis? What about this? Stay. I guess subscribe to the Logos Project. We'll be talking more about stuff, right? Like, just chill and stay in communion, right? Like, there's answers to this stuff, and I think a lot of people get confused from pundits and stuff. That's why I tell people, get off the internet and read some good, wise books.
Yeah.
Pray more. How about that?
Yeah.
Anyway, so Andrew, any last words before we tune out here?
I just want to thank you for doing the advanced read and for letting me come on your show and try to convince everyone why it's a good idea to buy my book. I've got your endorsement on the back cover here because I really valued it. Like I said, I think this is I hope to present something new here. I tried to go through the essential elements and show why it is that we just need to put our faith and trust in Christ and the church, and how that's the only way forward. And so your work and the stuff that you've recommended has been really helpful to me. It was really instrumental in me writing this book. I learned a lot from it. So yeah, everyone check out the rest of Dom's stuff. He's got great stuff. And yeah, I just want to thank you again for letting me come on your show and for a really good conversation.
Anytime. Thanks so much, Andrew. If you guys enjoy this conversation, please like this video. If you're watching but not subscribed, even if you disagree, why not subscribe? Hit the notification bell if you want to know when the next video you disagree with comes out. And if you do agree and you like this stuff, consider supporting me at patreon.com/the Logos Project, unless you want me to be homeless and to not make videos anymore. That being said, we'll see you all next time. God bless.